So you just chaired a panel on the role of First Peoples and in particular Pacific on about COP31 or about climate change.
Yep.
I've been fascinated about the role of the Pacific in influencing the outcome of the COP negotiations over the last 10 or 15 years. Why do you think it has had such an impact?
It's actually been more than 10 or 15 years. It's actually been the last 30 plus years. It has been something that the Pacific has been very aware of, has understood the impact of, and despite most of the world not actually listening for much of that time, has been consistent with this messaging that action is required, that it is an existential threat for the region, and one that shouldn't be taken lightly by anyone. And I think that messaging and that unity around message has been why the Pacific has been so effective in their climate advocacy and their ability to lever international consensus around some of the big, well, at least the core ideas around where we need to head.
That leverage, so you're talking Russia, China, America. How has that played out? Have you been to any of the COP negotiations?
I actually haven't, but it is something where those who have reflected, and I've had the benefit of having the conversations with people like Anton and others who've come through. And one of the things that was clear in much of the initial period was how difficult the conversation was, and how challenging it was to take on these major powers whose vested interests were so entrenched in the fossil fuel industry. And yet to have that voice and consistent voice there that then started to get support and coalescing. And people like Tony Marjoram from Marshall Islands were instrumental in achieving the 1.5 to stay alive position that actually was taken on then as part of the COP in 2016, remember it.
So unity and consistency, so like water on stone almost, eventually.
Yeah, well, it is something where, unfortunately, water on stone you can have for some millennia and it wears a little bit.
We need to move faster.
We have to move a lot faster, and that's where it is more like trying to get a high pressure hose into play on a less hard material, but hopefully we will get through eventually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's moving. It's moving. It really does feel like the world is moving in the right direction.
Well, I think the people have just suddenly realised that it's not just the Pacific and low island states and low-lying places that are being impacted by climate change. It's everyone.
I grew up in New Zealand and was around Pacific Island people a lot.
Should I apologise in advance?
Do you know what? I actually grew up in Otara in Auckland. So,
oh, right, okay.
The impact, the real felt impact for people in the Pacific of this challenge, literally losing their land, losing their homes. Like what does that feel like?
It's so much more than that. And you have to go to the Pacific, and this is where I encourage everyone who gets the opportunity to actually go to the Pacific and try and understand what it means to have climate change.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the idea of people's homes being, inundated by seawater. It's the fact that these low island states, which have survived for thousands of years on a thin layer of water that sits as their core survival position, with the inundation of seawater into that freshwater lens, destroys the opportunity not only of access to water, but also food, because the crops that were once grown can't grow on that land because it's salinated.
Yeah.
The impact of constant climate change events.
Cyclones.
Regular cyclones, but not just once or twice a year, but maybe even more, that are significant, has left the systems that have held the islands in good stead for thousands of years challenged, because they have to continually deal with this constant impact.
Constant change.
And recovery, and then another one comes in. And that's putting a strain not only on governments in the region and their ability to cope with that level of impact, but at the community level, where the sort of safety nets that have been part of the community's ability to sustain and manage and ensure the Pacific, continues as it has for, more than 1,000+ years, more in some cases. In the Melanesian countries, it's almost as long as those in Australia. To be able to continue in that way in the face of climate change is difficult. And it is something which people need to be aware of.
This resilience, total resilience is being broken down, taken away.
No, it's not a message, and I don't want the message to be one of, a deficit narrative, because the Pacific is incredibly resilient. We survived in this region for thousands of years on some of the most challenging environments. And, this idea of paradise, that the Pacific represents.
There we go, yes.
Is actually, it's seductive. When in fact, it's not an easy place to live and never has been. But this added challenge of climate change just adds that extra bit that makes it harder.
Tipping points.
Yeah.
So one final question. So we talked a lot, or you talked a lot about the role of government in solving for this challenge, and in particular leading up to COP31. So we're a business publication, or focused specifically on the role that business plays, and business plays a big role in the Pacific.
It does.
What role do you think business has in helping to solve for, or facilitating, supporting this, addressing this issue?
I think business has an enormous role. In fact, one, not just in terms of their own re-engineering and restructuring a business to adapt to a new world that isn't driven by fossil fuel. And that's, the key thing is it's not about energy, it's about fossil fuel energy. And again, that leans in as well into the Pacific, because the Pacific does have industry that is highly dependent, whether it's the tourism industry, whether it's shipping and logistics, whether it's the ability to have workers come to Australia on seasonal guest work. All of that takes fossil fuel at the moment.
Yeah.
And part of how we respond effectively as a country, but also as the businesses that underpin not just Australia, but the region, is how we adapt effectively and provide that leadership needed that allows for everyone to transition, not just groups within Australia.
So, leadership. You have a very stately way of speaking. You've obviously you're an experienced leader. What drove you to the path of leadership? Like what keeps you there? What's the story? My father was a minister of the church and a historian, and he was a great leader in his own right in the Pacific. He was the principal of Pacific Theological College back in the 90s, and taught many of the leaders actually in the region of a particular generation. And I think it is that example of the leaders of the Pacific who I grew up with as a child admiring, but who took on this great challenge of the post-colonial period, of coming out of some of the biggest impacts, not just of the colonial era, but the fact that they just had World War II and had to recreate a region out of something they did not ask to be part of, but were caught up in a global conflict that led to enormous damage in the region. This is the same as climate change. The Pacific has made zero contribution nearly to climate. You're suffering the brunt.
And yet is suffering the brunt of it. And again, that leadership, you don't have a choice. You have to take it on, because it's for the future and it's for the next generations that you want to do it for.
To help our next generation face their challenge. Thank you so much.